have we got online? Do we have Deb Money online? Who's the person and who's online? Oh, there's Deb. Great. And Mélanie Dieude. Oh, super. And then we also have Ray. So come on up, Ray and Mélanie. So Deb, I was thinking, I'm going to introduce everybody, but I was thinking we started working together in the early 1990s with the Canadian Women's HIV study. So we've been working together for a long time. So Deb is professor and head of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the University of British Columbia. She is the first formally trained individual in obstetrics and gynecology and infectious diseases in Canada. And she has established the first fellowship in infectious diseases for obstetrician gynecologists in the country. 7 trainees have completed it thus far. This is what we call real capacity strengthening, Deb. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, she led the CanCOVID PREG, which was the National Canadian Surveillance Program of COVID-19 and pregnancy, as well as a serosurveillance program using residual sera from antenatal care. So we'll hear from Deb in a little bit. Caroline Quach, hi Caroline, is a pediatric infectious diseases physician and medical microbiologist at the Centre Hospitalier Universitaire de Saint-Justine. And she's a professor in the departments of microbiology, infectious diseases and immunology, and pediatrics at the Université de Montréal. She's a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in infection prevention from hospital to the community. She's director of Popcorn, so if you've been wondering about Popcorn, you can find out more, perhaps in what she's going to talk to us about. And Popcorn brings together researchers, clinicians, and patient partners. It's a pan-Canadian pediatric research platform to answer important questions about child health. And she led various cohort studies during the pandemic in healthcare workers, as well as serosurveys in healthcare workers and in children, using residual samples. Adding to her CV, she's also chair of Quebec's Immunization Committee at the Institut National de Santé Publique de Québec since 2021. Welcome, Caroline. We have Mélanie Dieude, who's the Director of Research Operations, Medical Affairs and Innovations at EMA Quebec. And she's leading a team of more than 40 scientists working in various fields in transfusion medicine, stem cells, breast milk, human tissues for transplantation. She played a leading role in the scientific development of the Canadian Donation and Transplantation Research Program and served as its executive director from 2020 to 2022. So trained as an immunologist, she's a professor in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Infectious Diseases in the Faculty of Medicine at the Université de Montréal. And she's a researcher in the immunopathology axis of the Centre de Recherche at the Centre Hospitalier de l'Université de Montréal Research Center. She's working to reveal the interaction between, now we're really getting into the good stuff, zoonoses and immunosuppression, and to study autoimmune responses derived from vascular injury, of the importance in transplant and rejection, graft versus host disease, and systemic lupus erythematosus. So welcome, Mélanie. Now, Ray reminded me that we probably met several decades ago as well. He's a retired infectious disease physician. He presented himself a little bit earlier when we were going around at Ottawa Hospital and associate professor of medicine at the University of Ottawa. He serves as the chair of the Ottawa Health Science Network Research Ethics Board. Previously, he was the founding president of the Canadian Association of Research Ethics Board, led the initial development of the Ontario Cancer Research Ethics Board, served as a director of Clinical Trials Ontario, and sat on the Standing Committee on Ethics of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. He's actively involved, obviously, in research ethics and in studies of research ethics, particularly around areas of consent and the impact of innovative clinical trials designs. And he's presently the co-director of bioethics for COVARNet, the Coronavirus Variants Rapid Response Network. So each of you is allowed to have a presentation. I think it's 8 to 10 minutes. I don't know which way the slides are loaded, who's going to start, but we could begin perhaps with Deb, I think, if Deb's slides are loaded. Do we know?
I do have a slightly, can I share screen? Or
Yeah.
are we doing it just loaded from there?
You can share your screen if they make you co-host. You should be able to now, I think.
Is that working?
Yeah, it is. Just needs to put it in presentation mode and you'll be ready to go.
You good?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. So thanks very much, and thanks, Kate, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here virtually, although I do wish I was there with you in person. I feel unqualified to talk about ethics because ethics is not my area of expertise, but I'm happy to share my experiential learning on ethics through the COVID pandemic and so on. So just, you've maybe talked about it before, but, and Laurie alluded to this, what we did and from where we kind of were informed, plus some of our other studies, was that we had intended to do a pan-Canadian surveillance project to utilize the antenatal sera as a lens into the general population's seroprevalence because of the fact that many, if not all, pregnant women provide blood samples for the purposes of prenatal screening. And we had intended, because all these samples were there and in existence in many provinces, to be able to use this as a really effective response to aiding in the information for the public health response. Sorry, I'm just getting nice. There we go. So just to frame it, many of you know this, but essentially it's standard of care across Canada in every province and territory to do a relatively early prenatal blood sample for the purposes of assessing antibodies to HIV, rubella, hepatitis B, and so on. There is a somewhat separate and additional sample offered for the purposes of looking for serum markers of aneuploidy, which are more of a opt-in kind of thing, and not a slightly lower proportion of women participate in this. Are my slides still showing?
Yeah.
Just suddenly changed. Okay, good. And what we discovered is there is a little bit of difference across the country in terms of the way the samples are centralized. In many cases, they are centralized and assayed in provincial public health laboratories. And in many cases, they're stored for a year or beyond, making this a really great asset. However, that's not always the case. And as Laurie Beach pointed out, we had the opportunity for quite a bit of administrative data associated with these samples, but from a pragmatic perspective, we really limited to age and the first 3 digits of the postal code, which does have quite a bit of related information in it. But in the end, we were able to take samples, and the sample is then de-identified and the data is presented in aggregate fashion. And we can talk about it if you want, but there's lots of other administrative data and that Laurie alluded to that is in existence, but we didn't cross that mountain. So I'm going to put my observations into 4 typologies, I guess. This is just my little structure. This is no formal structure. It's just my observations. So the first situation was that serosamples were stored in a given jurisdiction. They were considered residual samples, and it was considered permissible to utilize these for anonymous seroprevalence studies. And I put anonymous in quotes because they are identifiable for early linkage purposes and then de-identified. And the ethical approvals were obtainable with a waiver of consent. And the ethics committees were in a mindset that waiver of consent was a possibility depending on the circumstances of the study in question. and that linked data for the purposes of aggregate analysis was acceptable to a point, and that was defined. And primarily, the ethical approval was obtained through university ethics boards, and then health authorities or similar jurisdictions were able to give approval for data access or sharing. And then data sharing agreements were able to be agreed upon between some jurisdictions. So that, I mean, I guess I'm highly biased. That was the preferred situation. So other situations were that sero samples were sent to a different jurisdiction from just pragmatic testing point of view for testing and stored in provincial laboratory facilities. But the source jurisdiction from which the samples came did not really have the setup for approval mechanisms to allow for this kind of public health serosurveillance. So didn't have in situ ethics committees and contracts approvals. And so that just stalled. One could imagine over many years and many negotiations, one could have got there, but in the time crunch of the pandemic, that was not feasible. Then there was again, I'm just calling this a pattern or a characteristic. We had antenatal sero samples collected and that was just how it was structured in distributed laboratories. So instead of having the centralized samples in provincial or research labs, the local regional laboratories were doing, say, HIV serotesting. Hence, the samples were either there or immediately destroyed and not available centrally for access, which may be functional for the region, not so great for this kind of purpose. However, there were the secondary samples, which are these samples that are taken for aneuploidy screening, again in early pregnancy, 2 time points usually, and they, because of the sophistication of the aneuploidy screening, are centralized in 1 or 2 laboratories, and they store those samples, and they're available for residual specimen testing. However, in some cases, the province would not permit, under almost any circumstance, the use of residual blood for serologic screening with a waiver of consent, requiring that each and every person attached to a blood sample needed to be contacted and retroactively or retrospectively individually consented, which you can imagine is a significant work burden. And then the fourth, and you could argue 3 and 4 are very similar, same situation of the distributed labs for the infection serotesting, but aneuploidy screening done at certain labs. But although technically, ethically permitted to get a waiver of consent, there was a difficulty getting agreements on basically who had jurisdiction over samples, who could transfer samples to whom, and became, I guess, bureaucratically mired. So that was less of a ethical issue, but more of a contracts and permissions issue. And I think you may hear this thematically within our provinces and territories. There's often lack of decision around who has the power, essentially, to permit either sample transfer, data sharing, whatever, and that makes all of these agreements extremely complex. So again, on reflecting on all of this, one does think about the fact that should we, and I think it's been alluded to, I think Tim was kind of alluding to this in the question, is should we be reframing our communication to public, either for routine or medically prompted blood samples, where they are asked in maybe an opt-out fashion that, would you permit your blood to be used for secondary use in a de-identified fashion? And that would be kind of attached to essentially every sample, or perhaps only attached to routine non-medically urgent samples where there's not really the same stress involved. But that would be a frame, kind of more of almost a Scandinavian approach, perhaps, to the way the public understands the use of their residual blood. Interestingly, we frequently use residual blood in clinical care, And I have yet in my career had a woman say, what, you've got residual blood and it's sitting there and you can use it? They're thrilled to know their blood sits there in the lab and is available for use. So I guess the other question is should we be trying to, I guess, socialize across all provinces and territories that a waiver of consent should be considered appropriate and necessary for proper serosurveillance work, because as soon as you start consenting people, you have huge bias in the nature of the sample you have. And surveillance or serosurveillance requires that it is for all, not just those that speak English, can read a consent, or French, and so on. And when you think about needing rapid responses in an urgent or emergent public health situation, that would be even a more important time to be able to do these things.
So, Deb,
and I think I sort of said it.
Yeah,
Sorry?
Are you just concluding because we need to move to the other speakers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I would just say that these are all issues that need to be dealt with, thought about, if we're going to use this data in a timely fashion in the future. And I think Hemonet serosurveillance could be used in a really effective way if we could solve some of these problems. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Deb. It completely blows my mind to hear this, because in 1988, we wanted to start doing anonymous unlinked seroprevalence studies using leftover filter paper from newborn testing. I did it for Quebec for 2 years of all the newborns in Quebec, but we required, it was convened by the equivalent of Health Canada, a meeting of ethicists from across the country to look at what would be the conditions for us to be able to do it. One condition was that women had to have access to a free available HIV test. You could not test someone else's, in this case it was newborn, reflecting maternal antibodies. You couldn't do that if the person didn't have access to the test. And we needed to gazette this with the population. There had to be news releases saying this is what's going on, and so on. We put posters up in clinics saying you could opt out if you wanted to. Nobody opted out. I mean, it was no big deal. If you wanted to find out your own result, you could. You knew what they were doing. The testing was completely unlinked to you. So there needs to be population discussion of this. I'm sorry to get emotional, but I just listened to Deb and I go, what? Okay, Caroline, could you tell us about popcorn and what you've been able to do?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm sorry for not being with you today. I got torn by other meetings and requests. Can you see my slides, Kate?
Yeah, good.
Okay, great. So maybe just starting by explaining what popcorn is. So we were funded during the pandemic in 2022 through a grant from CIHR with a goal of developing a network to support pediatric research, but to start with COVID at first. So Popcorn is a network of networks that includes the Pediatric Emergency Research Canada Network, PERN, which is the Inpatient Research Network, CCCTG, which is the Critical Care Trials Network, and a bunch of infectious diseases networks, which include CERN, PICNIC, IMPACT, with support from the Canadian Pediatric Society. We have various pillars in place. I think that what is most interesting out of Popcorn is EDI that supports it all, but also the patient partnership that we have where patient engagement is there at every step of the way, but also the implication and involvement of knowledge users from the questions that arise and back to them when we get answers from our studies. So our knowledge users are, of course, patient families, healthcare workers, and researchers, CCMOH, and the Public Health Agency of Canada. So out of the projects that we've done so far, we have a COVID cohort, which is the acute COVID study, where we've been recruiting in emergency rooms and enrolling patients who are tested for COVID, the cases, or in fact exposed, which are COVID positive, and the unexposed, which are COVID negative, that we follow over 9 months with various questionnaires, and we biobank those that accept the biobank. We have an indirect consequences group, which is looking through administrative databases at the impact of COVID and of the various measures put in place on mental health of our children and adolescents. And I think what is very good about this is that we've been able to have data for the entire country, which is not always the case. So we have Kai-High data for Canada, and we were able to partner with INES to get data from Quebec. So we have same methodology used across the country and are able to put out data for the entire country. And the last project, which is kernels, because, popcorn kernels, was funded through CITF in partnership with the Public Health Agency of Canada. And this is where we've been using leftover samples to follow seroprevalence for COVID in time. We are a regroupment of the 16 pediatric hospitals in Canada that you can see here, and we share resources through MyCERN, which is the coordinating center. We have master contracts and we try to have streamlined ethics. It hasn't been perfect, but not bad. We have a data coordinating center, communication, social media engagement, and a mentorship program. So if you want to know more, we have a website. I have to say, though, that the French translation is done automatically, so it's not the best thing. Somehow that thing thinks that back is dos and not retour, so whatever. Can't do anything about it. These are the participating sites. For kernels, everybody has been part of it. So what kernels has done is to use leftover blood samples from patients who are coming to the emergency room for whatever reason. And so we send them to labs in Ottawa and Toronto for serologies. I have to say, though, that there are 2 hospitals that haven't participated. Winnipeg, for reasons of feasibility and consent, they weren't able to get that waiver of consent, from what I understand. And Sherbrooke, which was for reasons of feasibility, they did not have the manpower to be able to go back into labs to get those samples. So we have been not recruiting, but using all children who have received through standard care a blood work in the emergency department, separated in 6 regions, defined as BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic. Each region were supposed to collect 6,000 samples over a year because this funding was only for a year, totaling 36,000 samples. And you see here what's sent to which lab. And so in terms of ethics and consent, so Quebec was able to get a public health surveillance mandate. And so when that was discussed with my REB chair, she said that we did not need REB approval for the province since this was surveillance. And we had a letter from Luc Boileau, who is still the Chief Medical Officer of Health for Quebec. We had, though, an add-on study where they also wanted to use leftover samples to detect various viruses based on infrared technology. For those, however, we had to get consent. So we needed to recruit participants in the ER with a full consent to say, can we use your leftover bloods to see if we're able to detect this virus or that virus? I have to say that the consent is usually easy because they don't need an extra poke. However, it requires resources because, of course, you need to approach the patient. So I think that in terms of long-term sustainability, if we have to go through consents, it's impossible. If you want to have large volumes of blood collected. In the other provinces, it's been on a case-by-case basis. So REB exemptions were given to Janeway Children's, IWK, CHEO, Kingston General Hospital, and BC Children's. And REB approval were required at Sick Kids, McMaster, London, Jim Pattison, so in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Edmonton. In all cases, however, the waiver of consent was approved. They still had to go through REB, but could get a waiver of consent. I think that the most complicated province is mine, where because of the civil code, it's almost impossible to get that waiver of consent. So I've been discussing with my REB chair to see moving forward what could be done in terms of reuse of leftover samples. And as much as she said that it's ludicrous to think that you would throw out those tests because it's not blood that we keep. Like unlike Deborah, we do not keep anything. You know, after 3 days, if the clinician hasn't called back to say, "Can I add, I don't know, CRP on whatever tube," we just throw them out. So it's instead of putting them in the garbage, we would just rescue them. But apparently that's not allowed by my REB. So we would have to go through a process like what Deb was suggesting of opting out, which means that everybody who would access care would get that consent. And unless they say, "I do not allow you to use whatever is left over," we would be able to use that. But that, of course, will take time, and we need to make sure that people understand what we want to do with it and how it's going to be used. So the next step is really that. So how do we use leftover blood samples, but not only blood, but also NP swabs and other specimens that are collected through standard of care? The question is it ethical to discard specimens if it's useful for surveillance or pathogen discovery? I think that if we said that it was for surveillance, we would probably be able to get around it. However, when funding comes from a research network, then it's almost impossible for the REB to get around it. I think that if we had an emergency situation and asked for a public health surveillance mandate, it would be feasible, but that's on a case-by-case basis. It depends on how much it actually is important to the CMOH in question. And it also depends on if you get along or not with that CMOH. I think it's possible, like in Deb's study, I know that Quebec wasn't able to participate at first. I don't know if at the end they were able to, but Isabelle Boucoiran, my colleague, was going nuts trying to get that that surveillance mandate, which was never given to her. Different CMOH, different approach. So that's it. I have to thank Sarah Ahira, who's our project manager at MyCern, for helping me with this presentation, because there were some data that I didn't have. So thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And I should clarify that all of my newborn testing that was done in 88, 89 was before the Civil Code was amended about 10 years later to not allow that kind of thing to happen. So that's why we've been having these trouble. You make a really good point, though, about funding and how it's perceived, if this is for surveillance versus research. And we have to keep that in mind when we get to Ray. But Melanie, it's up to you next.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to give you a little, oh yeah, you see it. Okay, good. So I'm going to give you our experience with putting in place PlasGov, which is our biobank at HEMA Quebec. And to give you a little bit, I don't know where to okay, good. Okay. So since the beginning of COVID pandemic, HEMA Quebec was playing a supportive role to the Quebec and Canadian healthcare network by conducting SARS-CoV-2 seroprevalence study, but in blood donors. And then we decided to set up the biobank and to facilitate study pertaining to the evolution of COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that's a really good, important point that Caroline just raised, the difference between seroprevalence studies and research. And I think the importance in looking at the ethical and the consent that we need to do the different activities, I think it's important. So our objective was, I'm going to go fast, constitute of cohort of frequent plasma donors. In fact, in our cohort, we can see that our plasma donors are not that old and not only male in Quebec. I don't know why, maybe we can study that. Maybe Christian has some hypothesis about that. So, and we wanted to systematically collect and store plasma samples to establish a database containing information on biobank donors, and to provide access to biobank samples and data to internal and external researchers. and of course have a governance that allow diligent management of the biobank and all the ethical and confidentiality issues. So the project was funded by the CITF. The specific projects such as seroprevalence was also funded by the ministry in Quebec. And other complementary funds were leveraged by several researchers for projects using Plascov samples. So how we did it, we collected samples, so plasma donor samples from all the sites in Quebec, 10 sites in the province, the fixed site, because of course we do collect outside of the fixed site, but we use those 10 sites. And so all plasma donors did participate. They had to, of course, give consent to participate. And they were also going through a medical questionnaire and socio-demographic and health data. So this is the variables that we were able to get through the questionnaire. And also we were able to link those data with some ministry data in terms of PCR infection and COVID-19 vaccination status. So the way we did it, we just draw a 3 ml tube of plasma directly from the plasma bag at the end of each donation. The tube were sent to R&D lab in Quebec City and then banked. And we manage research and development refusal on a receipt of the tube. So this is a little schematics. So you can see at the sites of donation, the donors were consenting, and then they were filling those medical questionnaires, and then they were doing their plasma donation. We were taking those 3 ml tubes, bringing them to Quebec City, the research R&D, and then we biobank them. And of course, in terms of data, we have data merging from the sites, from donor data, and also we had an inventory management platform to manage samples and aliquot that were merged in the SAS system. So in terms of flexibility and agility, within 8 months, we had over 80,000 samples collected from 15,000 donors. We had 10,000 frequent donors and a lot of freezer space, as you can believe. And this is the cohort right now. So we have over 200,000 plasma sample from over 20,000 donors, 98%, 89%, close to 90% participant rate, which is quite high. We have that, we had that computerized medical questionnaire that was added in 2022 before it was paper. And then we ended new donor recruitment in October 2, 2nd, 2022, and just ended collection in July this year. So we have, of course, our governance framework. I'm not going to go through that, but I'm going to explain to you how you can access those samples. So when researchers want to access samples and data from plasma cohort, they have to go through a scientific committee for approval in terms of relevance and scientific quality. Of course, relevance is important because the consent is really based on COVID-19 studies. So that's why we have to go through this relevance quite importantly. And then if the protocol is approved, it goes through our HEMA Quebec Research Ethics Committee for ethical acceptability. And then we get the authorization to access biobank samples and data. And just to give you examples, so we did seroprevalence studies with l'Institut national de santé publique du Québec and the Ministère de la Santé et des Services sociaux. We also did longitudinal serological studies to better understand the evolution, particularly during the Omicron wave. And just to give you some examples of studies that emerged from Plascov samples and data, and there's more to come even now. There was limitation in that strategy. Only plasma samples were available, so we could not use a sample for cell-based immunity or genetics. Despite the large sample, you know, it's really representative of healthy population, and someone alluded to immunosuppressed population. I know I'm quite interested in that population as well. like we're not getting those samples through blood services in general. All exclusion criteria for plasma donation were also exclusion criteria for the biobank, obviously, and the database associated with our biobank does not include information on disease severity, such as hospitalization or intensive care unit or admission in terms of COVID, of course. It does not include information on socioeconomic status, but we have the 6-digit zip code that can be used to generate a proxy for socioeconomic status. In terms of strength, this strategy gave us a quite large biobank of plasma sample dedicated to COVID-19 research. And again, I insist, research. The cost of establishing the biobank was minimized by leveraging our logistics at the, as a blood bank. Donors provided a broad consent, which allowed researchers to recontact them for other projects, which is quite important to think about. We use it quite often now. And the large subset of donors had more than 2 samples, which, and some of them, a lot of samples actually, enabling the conduct of longitudinal analysis on COVID immunity. So food for thought, happy to answer questions.
Thank you. I sort of feel like we're in a relay race, and the anchor of our team here is Ray, who's going to try to help us think through some of the privacy and ethical consent management issues for residual blood. So, Ray.
Thanks, Kate. I'd like to preface my remarks with a misquote from Humphrey Bogart. And I say this on behalf of COVARNet and the COVARNet Biobank. Tim, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. We've heard a lot about what I will construe as trying to build a learning public health care system. What I'm going to be talking about is the COVARNet experience, and it relates to contracts and it relates to the ethics. Do I press on the green button?
You press it in that direction.
Big green. Voila. We heard, starting with Tim's introduction, about the limitations of a reactive approach to a pandemic. It was too slow, and it was completely inadequate. The healthcare emergencies warrant a timely response. What we need is preparedness, and we've built, we hope, the infrastructure in the COVARNet Biobank for future emergencies with people, coordinated lab, data, and clinical staff ready to respond, and facilitation of the exchange of materials and data, which has required REB approvals, and the applicable rules for ethics, the Tri-Council policy statement, were modified several months ago to facilitate this sort of thing. It's disappointing to hear that that not all centers have responded to it. And we've undergone a painful process of developing contracts. Like other painful processes, it has resulted in very useful progeny. COVARNet has a similar org diagram to what Caroline described. It has multiple pillars. 7 of the 10 are laboratory-based. The biobank data platform and bioethics are integrated as one collectivity. And we have a wastewater group, biosafety lab group, Cable, and Cube environmental samples. So a cross-cutting group of mostly laboratory scientists, mostly non-physicians. We have taken, and the previous session was a wonderful segue to what I have to say, I believe. What we construe as a federated biobank network, and I'll get into that. I grew up in Montreal, where I learned about an independent Quebec and a unified Canada, and we've accepted that sort of model, where each biobank runs its own shop and it shares information with everybody else. So there's local autonomy, there's local control, but facilitation of open, fair, rapid data exchange, materials exchange among stakeholders, researchers, public health, industry, any appropriate partner. How does it work? Well, each individual biobank has its own data and its own samples. It is the steward of its own samples. Using a interpretation system, an application programming and interface, which David could explain to you if, since I really don't understand this sort of thing. It is translated into common language so that information, so there's not a problem with the use of different data systems. So the data, the library catalog is held centrally. The samples are held at their host sites. So we have the biobank, we have a data platform. If on the right, if you, as an investigator, would like to use some of the samples and the metadata that accompany the samples, you can access the catalog to know what you're asking for, learn the feasibility of it, and make an application to use the data to do your study. Each biobank has its own ethics approval for the collection, and what we ensure is that the consent process allows for secondary use. There is a plan afoot to waive a requirement for REB approval for biobanks. We think it's useful to have some vetting in order for quality control of the original consent process. We have a sample and data collection program that has been approved by Clinical Trials Ontario, applicable to Ontario sites. It allows for secondary use, it allows for adults and children. One of the changes to the Tri-Council policy statement, which are the applicable rules for for this sort of study, is that single national ethics review is allowed for minimal risk studies. We have not tested that yet, but will. This does not include the contract side, which is obviously a whole other major facet. So in principle then, the Ontario approval can be implemented nationally. The Tri-Council policy rules require that each secondary use requires REB review. Consent has been already addressed in the biobank consent, in the collection consent. And so these studies can be reviewed by delegated review at whatever level they have to be reviewed. A pride and joy of our biobank is the Universal Data and Biological Materials Transfer Agreement. Just flows off the tongue. It's a pre-established, ready-to-use contract system for sample collection and use, which is essential to facilitate multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, collaborative research. It allows for the rapid exchange of samples, data, and reagents. It addresses all the hot-button issues: privacy, sample, data custody, intellectual property, authorship. All that's required is an implementation letter. It was painful to get it going. It took over a year. We were flat-footed in our response. A very important element in this whole system is Indigenous engagement, both within Covarnet and training within it, having a particular pillar related to that, partnering with the First Nations Information Governance Center, and following very carefully the Tri-Council policy rules involving the engagement of Indigenous communities at all levels of the research, from the conception to the execution to the data sharing. I think that specifically related to the use of blood donors, a gratuitous comment is that the donor has to show up, and it seems to be entirely easy to obtain consent, and I think it would be a very important consideration for CBS to ask people for the secondary use of excess bloods for public health research writ large. It's been my experience that high standards of ethics oversight facilitate streamlining. It's easier to get institutional buy-in particularly from arrogant institutions that are used to doing things their own way. The reactive approach is too slow. We need preparedness. We're ready for that next big one. Our collective process is plastic in terms of being adaptable to different kinds of subject areas, different kinds of research, clinical trials, or whatever. And we build in explicit consent for secondary research. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. And I'm really glad that you brought up Indigenous peoples. We had one of our studies, really interesting, one of the studies funded by the task force appointed a biospecimen guardian who actually accompanied the specimens from the First Nations communities to the National Microbiology Laboratory for 2 weeks and saw exactly what happened every step of the way to those specimens. There was cultural ceremonies. There's going to be one next month where those specimens are going back now to the communities. Again, reflecting the OCAP principles, the ownership, I have to remember them all the time: ownership, control, access, and possession, because it's something we need to think going forward with HEMANET. We've got to figure out how to engage with Indigenous communities and how to think through the ethical issues there. But
right. There's a history of exploitation. There is a history of undue burden of disease in these communities. Oftentimes, there is an opportunity for the research to benefit the communities. And it seems so easy to start by listening.
how true, how true. Okay, we're opening it up. We've got about 10 minutes, I think. 9 minutes left for questions or comments from the audience. Anybody wants to raise something? A couple people going up to the mic. Great. Go ahead. Introduce yourself and then start your question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Manasa Korapalli. I'm a research assistant with the HEMANET team. And the past few months, I've been having a lot of these conversations with the different HEMANET partners about data privacy, consent, you name it. And I'm particularly directing this question at Caroline because this is one of the few conversations I left feeling very hopeful that this is possible for HumanNet. So considering that, I feel like, in my opinion, like HumanNet is very analogous to what Kernel has done. And I just wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what the feasibility of replicating this for HumanNet is, considering that HumanNet is targeting a larger population, and it's also not, it's also using different samples, not only from hospitals, but from provincial labs and CBS and Human Quebec and stuff like that.
Larger and older population.
That's true, yeah.
Caroline.
And another thing was that we spoke to Sarah, your project manager, and my impression was that Kernel uses a centralized system of data collection, not federated. So how is this possible, is my question also.
So I'll start maybe with the data collection piece. We have data transfer agreements between all of our sites and our data coordination center based in Edmonton. So people just enter data into RedCap that is housed directly there. However, the data that are entered are completely anonymized. So we can't go back to see who was what. We destroy every single linkage because this is just a surveillance project. As for my hopes for the future, I think that the difference between what Kernel has been doing and what HumanNet is aiming to do is HumanNet is pathogen agnostic. So you want to keep samples and you want to test not only for a pandemic pathogen, but you could test for toxins and whatever else, which I think is a completely different ballgame, mainly in Quebec. Maybe in other provinces, you'd be able to get away with it without the civil code. I think that in Quebec, we'd have to do a pretzel, and it's not a popcorn anymore. We'd become a pretzel to be able to get something to work. I have to say that my only hope is that we're able to set up this opt-out consent in quotation mark, and hopefully all of the hospitals in Quebec will eventually have consent as for when you enter care. You don't only consent to care, but also consent to research. Because at this point in time, the additional complexity is that if I want to approach a family for a research project, then I have to go through the treating team who then would present the project to say, are you in agreement to be contacted by the research team? So it's an additional step that we would love to just skip and say, you enter a hospital, you consent to care and to be approached for various projects, but that's not there yet. So we have hopes. I have to say that my REB chair is amazing, and she's always trying to find ways out of the regular approach. But as of now, her REB committee has refused the use of leftover samples, even if we tried to tell them that they were going in the garbage anyway. So.
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions, and the first one is, I'm not sure, maybe just like, a question because I don't understand the difference as a whole lot, but we talked a lot about the ethics, ethical requirements for secondary sample use, consent, and etc. Is there sort of an overlaying legal requirement in all of the provinces? How does it connect to ethical, in one province versus another? And is there a way to also harmonize that requirement, like the legalities of it? Because, for example, in BC, we were able to only get the RAB requirement for secondary sample use for COVID because of public health order. But I know that otherwise it's actually a bit more complicated for other purposes. So can we talk about the legal side?
We go with your first question first. So I think Deb is probably best placed, has the most experience with trying to see the different approaches in different provinces. There's nothing standardized. Deb.
Well, yeah, I mean, the challenge is we have a federation. The country is not really strictly a unified country. It is provinces and territories that have their own jurisdictions around many, many things, but particularly in health. And although I'm told, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm told that the intent of legislation, although slightly worded differently in different provinces, is essentially the same, with the exception of Quebec. But the interpretation by privacy officers and those that give permission or not for data sharing ends up almost at the personal level. So you can have a individual lawyer or officer in a privacy situation in a health authority having a broader picture interpretation of the intent of the legislation, which is to not harm people, but also not to secure data and samples to the degree that you are harming the population by not allowing access to those. So they are able to balance that ethically and morally, and in that case, permit release. And BC is not perfect, but we have a reasonable, generally, interpretation of legislation. But you can take very similar legislation in other province, and the interpretation of it may be, we can't let anything out. We must hold it. We mustn't have permission for this. And that is difficult when there is not a standardized agreement at the federal level that has been negotiated with the provinces to permit a standardized permission system.
That's exactly what we need. That's exactly what we need. Yes, Ben.
Some reminiscent from my previous life in organ donation and transplant, in jurisdiction where it was easy, the REB from different sub-jurisdiction, if you want, would talk to each other and highlight experts in the field to work together and to have a more unifying REB for this very, question of interpretation of different. I think it's a little bit different with Quebec with a different code, but I think there's, having REB talking to each other, or putting a management something together. I think it would be an important way to see things around, and what are the points that are really critical and that are blocking in different provinces, for example. And so anyways.
That's what we did in 1988, and it seems like we need to do it again, where you bring everybody around the table to talk about what are the barriers in their own provinces, how can we come to consensus on this to be able to move forward. Ray?
Just to say that the ethics rules, the applicable rules, are national. They're the same everywhere. The REBs play by those rules within a legal context. So what we're talking about is the law. The relevant law tends to be either health law, or which is intended to be directed at clinical care, or privacy legislation. But it only indirectly relates to research, which is, I think, Deborah's problem, that everybody has abundant latitude to interpret widely. I had the good fortune a couple of weeks ago to attend part of a discussion among privacy experts about the new privacy legislation in Quebec, wherein there was an amazing appreciation of the value of the use of data. So I think the issue that we're confronting is risk aversion on the part of lawyers. And I think now is the time, in the pre-pandemic period of the next big one, to bring together these people as you're suggesting.
Okay, thank you. Could you quickly just give your question, because we've been told we have to break, but go ahead, make your comment.
Okay, so I think Caroline mentioned that it's sometimes difficult to claim public health umbrella for activities that are research funded. And I think it's actually quite a wrong way of viewing it as a very dichotomous kind of, set of activities. So what are your thoughts on how we can encourage policymakers, academics, everybody to see it more as a continuum rather than as a dichotomous kind of proposition?
I don't know who wants to respond to that, because we have this theme that's been weaving through today about surveillance versus research.
So I can answer with some experience. So we have projects at HEMA Quebec that really are directed through, detecting new pathogens that are important for wrist infusion, and this is not research, this is quality, this is, you know, of what we're doing as activity. But as soon as we switch to research, and this is a very tiny line, and every time we have to, we talk to our legal people, we talk to our REB, and and we're always on that line, always, and it's not clear. So I don't have a good question for you, but it is certainly a challenge.
A lot of the principles that we're intending to protect with either system are the same. We want to respect people's rights, and we want to advance the public weal. So it seems as if we should be able, like the old license plate in Quebec used to say "faut se parler."
Faut se parler.
And I think, you know, we got to talk about it, and we have to come to a resolution because the public needs it.
Thank you. I just want to thank the stellar committee today. The panel was just great. Thank you for joining us, Deb and Caroline, and thank you both to you in the room here, and thank you to our audience. You get a break now and come back at 4 on the dot.
Thanks very much.